August 21st, 1995, Atlantic Southeast Airlines Flight 529, a twin-propeller Embraer 120 Brasilia with 29 people on board, is en route from Atlanta, Georgia to Gulfport, Mississippi. While climbing through 18,000 feet, everyone on board hears a loud thud that comes from the left side of the plane, and the pilots struggle to fight with the plane's controls. The torque on the left engine decreases to 0, and the plane begins rolling left and pitching down, descending at 5,500 feet per minute. The passengers on the left side of the plane can see the propeller on the number 1 engine appears to have exploded and is a mangled mess distorting the left wing. The pilots attempt to return to Atlanta, but realize they are losing altitude too quickly to make it back. They ask for an alternate airport, and air traffic control suggests West Georgia Regional Airport. The crew attempts to keep the plane in the air, but they're unable to make it to the airport. The pilots attempt an emergency landing in a field, but the plane pitches over and begins an uncommanded dive, striking treetops before hitting the ground nose first. The aircraft skids along the ground before finally coming to a stop. What caused the left engine to malfunction? Could anything have been done to make it back to the airport? Did anybody survive this crash? Find out on this episode of Black Box Down.
You didn't say, I was like, how many people survived?
I didn't want to give it away. Again, we're always trying things maybe a little different.
No, it's
adding
good.
A little mystery here.
I'm hooked.
Good.
And I'm also Chris, and you're Gus.
I'm Gus, yeah. We're here with another episode of Black Box Down. Before we get into the meat of it, of course, as always, I want to remind everyone to give us a follow on social media at Black Box Down Pod, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter. We'll post images and videos, whatever, to try to help you have a better understanding of what was happening in the incident.
Yeah, and we also have merch if you want to check that out, which we appreciate if you get it and support it. It's really cool. We like all of our merch.
I didn't want to say it, but yeah, I do.
It's all good merch. You can find that in our link tree for Black Box Down, or just go to store.roosterteeth.com and you can find it.
So just in case, I guess before we get into this incident and not our normal sidetracks, Chris, we're recording things a little differently today. So this episode and the next one might sound a little different. It's been some severe weather in the Austin area, so we cobbled together a little ad hoc recording setups to get this episode and the next one recorded. So apologies if it sounds different. If it sounds better, you're welcome. I doubt it will. Anyway, Flight 529 was an Embraer 120 Brasilia. It's a 30-passenger commuter airline powered by twin turboprop engines equipped with Hamilton standard propeller blades. So this is a 2-propeller plane. Not very big, holds about 30 passengers.
Yeah.
The aircraft was manufactured by Embraer, which is the 3rd largest producer of civil aircraft after Boeing and Airbus. The regional airline Atlantic Southeast Aviation operated nearly 900 flights a day. And at the time, they were based in College Park, Georgia, and was a wholly owned subsidiary of SkyWest Incorporated. So they were a regional airline that was a subsidiary and owned by another regional airline.
Okay, so like
nesting dolls.
I was going to say, I was like, this plane can't be big.
No.
They're flying to Gulfport, Mississippi, which I lived in Mississippi. I've never even heard of Gulfport, Mississippi.
You haven't heard of Gulfport?
No.
I assume it's by the water.
I assume so too.
I've heard of Gulfport. In another lifetime, I did tech support, and one of our clients had a location in Gulfport, Mississippi. So this kind of plane, you really don't see it all that often anymore. All Embraer Brasilia, in general, were retired from service in 2003. So it would be considered an older plane at this point. But this incident was back in 1995, so still newer. It was kind of a fast plane, I believe. So this specific flight was captained by Edwin Ed Ganaway, who was 45 years old, and First Officer Matthew Matt Warmerdam, who was 28 years old. Ganaway was a skilled pilot with 9,876 total hours of flying experience, of which 7,374 flight hours were in the Embraer Brasilia. So quite a bit of flying, and specifically quite a bit of flying in this type of plane.
Mm-hmm.
Warmerdam was hired by the airline in April of 1995, had logged a total of 1,193 flight hours, of which 363 hours were in the Embraer Brasilia at the time of the accident. So not as experienced, but still, that's decent time.
Yeah.
The sole flight attendant was named Robin Fitch. She had been with the airline since February of 93. And the passengers were mostly business travelers, 6 engineers, 2 deputy sheriffs, 2 Air Force personnel, a minister, a woman who was training to become a flight attendant. Actually, she was planning on becoming a flight attendant.
Sorry, you almost sound like you're setting up a joke or something. All right, so 2 police officers, a minister, and
no. This is so just to kind of put it in perspective, you said you're probably not a big plane flying to Gulfport. There's a lot of business travelers and people who are going between cities down in the American South. This specific plane had been assigned to the airline's Dallas-Fort Worth, Texas hub until about a week before the accident when it was transferred to the Atlanta hub because they were preparing for a check of which they needed to do on the plane at every 3,300 hours.
Like just a maintenance check? So it came out of its normal flying thing because they do the checks here at either in Atlanta, probably?
Actually, the check was going to be in Macon, Georgia.
Okay.
So close to Atlanta, you know. The airline had their maintenance facility in Macon. So they had reassigned the plane from Dallas to Atlanta. That way it was close to Macon. That way they could do their maintenance check. But of course, the accident happened before they were able to do that inspection at Macon. The airplane had an operating cockpit voice recorder and flight data recorder. And, they were recovered in good condition with only minor sooting. So the investigation was actually able to use these things to aid them when they were trying to figure out what happened. So
that's good.
Yeah, it's always good. It's not always the case. We've done plenty of these where that doesn't happen. So on the day of the accident, August 21st, 1995, the accident flight crew began a 2-day trip at Macon, Georgia, and they operated the accident airplane from Macon to Atlanta, and they had a jump seat rider who was another captain from that same airline, and that they reported that flight was uneventful, and the crew appeared to be rested, and everything was normal. Nothing unusual. No unusual stressors before the flight.
Okay.
In Atlanta, the captain remained in the airplane on the ground to receive the air traffic control clearance, and the first officer deplaned and remained in the immediate area. The accident flight, number 529, was cleared for an IFR flight plan from Atlanta to Gulfport. So IFR, that means instrument flight plan. Most commercial airlines, like when you're on a passenger plane, most of the time it's an IFR flight. Even if it's visual rules outside, they'll usually pick up an IFR just in case they have to go through clouds.
Mm-hmm.
But on this specific day, it was kind of cloudy.
That's what I say. It was. How was the weather?
Yeah, it was not bad weather, but there were clouds in the area, so that's why they would pick up an IFR clearance. That way, they can go through clouds. They were cleared to depart Atlanta and make their flight at flight level 240, which is 24,000 feet. Supposed to fly for about just under an hour and a half, hour 26 minutes. And the first officer prepared the manifest. It had 26 passengers, 3 crew members, 724 pounds of cargo, and about 2,700 pounds of fuel for departure. I'm sure you can tell based on the intro I read, wasn't a fuel problem. They did not run out of fuel.
Well, I hope if running out of fuel makes your propeller explode.
No, that's not a good thing. So the flight taxied from the ramp area at 12:10, and they were airborne at 12:23 p.m.
Mm-hmm.
At 12:36, the first officer reported to the west departure sector of Atlanta that they were climbing past 13,000 feet. And at about 12:42, following several intermediate climb clearances, the controller issued a clearance to climb and maintain flight level 240, which the flight crew acknowledged. And like we said, that was supposed to be their cruising altitude. The flight data recorder and the cockpit voice recorder indicated that at 12:43 and 25 seconds, while climbing through 18,100 feet at 160 knots, several thuds could be heard from the cockpit, and the torque on the left engine decreased to 0. The airplane then rolled left and pitched down, and subsequently started to descend. Immediately thereafter, the flight data recorder shows numerous flight control inputs consistent with an attempt to counteract the flight path deviations. However, the airplane attitude decreased to about 9 degrees nose low, and the airplane began a descent rate that progressed to about 5,500 feet per minute.
So this is probably sounding dumb, and I'm looking up right now. Torque, measure of the force that can cause an object to rotate about an axis. So
when the torque goes to 0, that essentially means the propeller's not spinning.
Okay.
So that's the alert that they're getting in the cockpit. They have gauges that can measure the torque, and they see the torque on their left engine is 0. So essentially, that would, not knowing anything else, that would tell them their left engine's not working.
That they can't do anything with that.
Either.
Yeah.
Yeah. I for whatever reason, I don't know in general what would cause that, but I would assume it would be things like the engine dies, or maybe it flames out, propeller stops spinning. Just something's wrong with the left side, and it's not producing thrust for them.
Okay. I don't think we'd refer often of things in terms of torque.
Yeah.
So that's why I was...
Yeah. So just think of it as no power. And like we established here, that kind of coincides with what we're seeing here.
Mm-hmm.
The airplane's rolling left because left engine not working, right engine's working. Airplane pitches down and starts to descend.
And how capable are these planes of flying with just one engine?
Totally fine. Any kind of plane, if it's designed to carry passengers and you get on it, should be able to fly with just one engine.
Okay. So in theory, they should be fine?
Yes. Let me read one more sentence and then I'll come back to that.
And then you'd be like, but...
At this point, when all this is going on, the captain said, "I can't hold this thing." Then help me hold it. At 12:44 and 26 seconds, the first officer declared an emergency with Atlanta Center and stated, we've had an engine failure. Atlanta Center cleared them direct back to the Atlanta airport. So going back to the question you asked, any plane should be able to fly with one engine. I'm only saying this now because I already kind of spoiled it in the intro. Like I said in the very beginning, the passengers could see that the left engine had kind of exploded and it was warping the wing.
So it wasn't stable. So that's
correct. That's making things worse. So normally, if the engine just died and was just sitting there, that's fine. But when it
blows off part of the plane,
right? When it starts distorting the wing, then you're not getting as much lift as you should. Instead of kind of being neutral in the process, it's robbing the plane of lift. So it's going to make that desire of the plane to roll to the left even worse than normal, and it's going to cause them to not be able to maintain their altitude, which is why they start this kind of fast descent that's going on here. There's another little twist to it, but I'm not going to get to that yet. We'll get to that in a little bit.
That's just a tease.
That's a little tease. According to data from the flight data recorder and cockpit voice recorder, airspeed and descent rate changes continued and were accompanied by abrupt excursions in vertical and lateral acceleration values. And that just means their descent rate and their velocities were not stable in any axis.
Okay. They're just
kind of like
wobbly?
Yeah, wobbly. That's a good way to put it. Wobbling around in the air. At 12:45 and 46 seconds, the cockpit voice recorder revealed that the first officer informed the flight attendant they had an engine failure and he had declared an emergency and they were going back to Atlanta. He told her to brief the passengers. And this is the little thing I teased about earlier. The passengers and the flight attendant could all see out the window that the engine, they could see the extent of the damage to the engine, but the pilots didn't know the extent of the damage to the engine.
They just heard a thump, thump, and then
no torque.
And then no torque.
So as far as they know, it's just an engine failure. They don't realize that the engine has kind of come loose along with the propeller and is distorting that left wing and robbing them of their lift.
Like come loose as in like dangling? Like
yeah, it's not like hanging loose. It's kind of turned itself. Since if you think about the propeller, it's got that angular velocity to it. When it failed, it kind of twisted a bit.
Oh, so it's like
it kind of like turned itself into the wing a bit.
Gotcha. So now it's just really disrupting the airflow in a way. So it's not as if the engine exploded and there's a hole. It's there. It's just
kind of shifted
around in a way that's like stopping airflow. Okay.
Exactly. So that's why that's an extra complication, and the pilots don't know that. And that this is the only time that the pilots and the flight attendant talk, and the flight attendant does not tell the pilots what the passengers have seen, right? Because the flight attendant assumes the pilots know what's going on,
but they can't.
But they haven't seen it. At 12:46 and 13 seconds, the first officer stated, "We're going to need to keep descending. We need an airport quick. Roll the trucks and everything for us." So he's talking to the air traffic control, basically telling them they're going to keep descending and get emergency trucks out there.
And how much? I mean, probably not a ton because they're just trying to land. But I mean, if the flight attendant had told them, "Hey, this is the state of the outside," would that have changed? I mean, it seems like they're not going all the way back to land anyway. They're just like trying to, at this point, they're like, we got to land.
Right. Well, at first they had talked about going to Atlanta, and that was the initial plan. And then, they get, and not too much time passes, just a couple minutes, and then they decide on West Georgia instead. What could have done? It's hard to say. I don't know really anything that could have been done differently. Maybe they could have expedited and been a little more direct to West Georgia. But they were already pretty direct. It's like
that's
armchair quarterbacking. I don't know. Maybe if they knew, they could have handled things a little differently, but it's hard to say.
Yeah.
The controller gave the crew heading information to West Georgia Regional Airport, and the flight crew applied various combinations of flight control inputs and power on the right engine, partially stabilizing the airplane descent rate to between 1,000 and 2,000 feet per minute, and the airspeed to between 153 and 175 knots. The Atlanta Center controller lost the flight's transponder code from radar when the airplane descended through 4,500 feet because, there's a vertical component to it. It's harder to read it because they're further away and they're also getting low.
And is that just because they like have it set to the wrong, I don't know, in terms of like a radio, right? You're like on the wrong channel?
No, it's more that
just
they're further than normally. This controller would not be talking to a plane that far out, and they've gotten low. It's almost like it's because of if you think about it, it's like almost the curvature of the Earth.
The Earth, okay.
Right? It starts blocking, and you can't really get a signal. You need to have a certain amount of altitude in order for it to be picked up.
Okay, and even more things like interfering, like
Exactly.
a big building or trees and
Or
a
the
hill or
signal
mountain. Yeah,
might be too weak, or for whatever reason. That's why normally you need a little more altitude or need to talk to someone else. But at around the same time, at 12:50, that air traffic controller instructed the crew to contact Atlanta Approach Control, which is a different controller. And this is the controller who would normally handle the approaches out at that West Georgia Regional Airport.
Okay.
So the crew contacts that new controller and requested the localizer frequency and vectors for West Georgia Regional Airport. So they're requesting everything to try to get lined up for an instrument approach, a non-precision approach into that airport. And the controller tells them the information they're asking for, and the flight crew acknowledges. And they requested vectors for a visual approach. So even though they're getting the instrument approach information loaded up, they're requesting a visual approach, which can be faster.
Okay.
So it's like, maybe, for an instrument approach, you might have to go out a little further, get everything set up, and then, come in for the landing. But when a visual approach means you can see the airport, well, you would do a visual approach when you can see the airport, and you kind of go straight in for it.
And so he's getting both just in case.
Right. So they're getting everything set up for the instrument approach, and then they're asking for vectors so they can come in for a visual approach. I think at this point, there's still clouds obscuring them, but they know that they're going to dip down through the clouds, and then they'll be able to see the airport. And they're like, just in case, well, we have the instrument stuff, but we're gonna try to vector in and land on a visual. The controller verified the altitude of their plane and that the plane was in visual flight rules, VFR, because you need visual flight rules to be able to do a visual approach, and said fly heading 040, airports at your about 10 o'clock, 6 miles. At 12:51 and 47 seconds, the pilots acknowledged 040 ASC 529. This transmission was the last one received by the approach controller from the accident flight. At 12:51 and 30 seconds, the airspeed steadily decreased from 168 knots to about 120 knots. Flight data recorder and cockpit voice recorder information indicated that the landing gear and flaps remained retracted, which you would think they would. That's probably the right thing to do, because once you drop landing gear and flaps, that's more drag. It's going to slow you down, and it's going to make you descend faster. And they're trying to stretch out their flight path to make it to the airport.
Okay.
Cockpit voice recorder sounds indicated the first ground impact occurred at about 12:52 and 45 seconds. So to answer your earlier question, Chris, you asked, we kind of left it hanging as to whether or not there were survivors on this flight. And there were a total of 29 people on the plane, 26 passengers, 3 crew members. In the crash itself, only one person initially died.
Ooh. I say ooh, someone died, but also that's good.
Yeah, it was, unfortunately, it was the captain of the plane. He suffered injuries during the crash. However, post-crash, more people died once the plane was on the ground. All told, there's an asterisk on this one. All told, depending on how you count it, and I'll get into that in a bit, there were either 9 or 10 fatalities total on this plane. Out of the 29 people who were on it.
Roughly a third.
Yeah. And we'll get into kind of the specifics of that here in just a bit. In post-crash interviews, survivors indicated that during the climb out, they heard a loud sound and felt the airplane shudder. They also indicated that 2 or 3 blades from the left propeller were wedged against the front of the wing. Like we talked about, it's not like the engine just drooped down. It kind of turned and those propellers got wedged into the wing itself.
Oh.
The flight attendant said that she looked out the left side of the aircraft and observed a mangled piece of machinery where the propeller and the front part of the cowling was. Other passengers observed the propeller displaced outboard from its original position on the engine. The flight attendant stated that after the first officer notified her of the flight's emergency return to Atlanta, she prepared the cabin for an emergency landing and evacuation. She stated she had no further dialogue with the flight crew. Investigators found the left engine propeller assembly early in the ground debris path. The propeller hub contained 3 complete blades, and about 1 foot of the inboard end of the 4th blade was protruding from the hub. The remainder of the 4th blade was not at the accident site. Does that tell you anything?
Oh, so it fell off
It probably,
somewhere whenever that was one of the thud booms?
That's most likely what that noise was, and that's what caused the whole assembly to
shift
and end up impacting the wing. So it fell off initially whenever the problem first started. The main wreckage area consisted of the cockpit, fuselage, right wing and engine, and the empennage, which is like the tail section. Portions of 2 of the right engine's propeller blades remained attached to the propeller hub and engine. The remaining 2 blades of the right engine propeller assembly were located nearby. See, the right engine, which was working, all of the blades and everything, it's there.
Like,
the left engine, it's like, oh, there's a part missing that's not anywhere around here. That's not right. An area of the grass leading up to and surrounding the main wreckage was burned out to a radius of about 30 feet. This was a pretty rural area where it went down, and it was this sounds more dramatic than it really was, but essentially it was in someone's backyard, but it's not like a suburban backyard. It's like, like if someone has like a lot of land, and this couple saw the plane crash on their property, and they call for rescue services like, hey, a plane just crashed in our backyard, and they went out there to try to help people.
That's nice of them.
Yeah. The airplane came to rest at the northwest end of an 850-foot wreckage trail that was aligned on a heading of about 330 degrees magnetic. So they were heading pretty north. Numerous trees were sheared off prior to ground contact, consistent with a descent angle of about 20 degrees and an increasing left wing down attitude of 15 to 40 degrees. So that's kind of what I was saying earlier. Like, most likely they could no longer counteract that asymmetric lift, and the left wing went down.
And they didn't have altitude to
trade for speed.
Yeah.
Impact with the trees extended for about 360 feet, and following the last tree impact, a debris path continued for 490 feet through an open field on a slightly upsloping terrain for the main wreckage.
They never put their landing gear down?
No.
Not that it would have mattered.
I mean,
the way they hit.
Yeah, sometimes it can help. I think we've talked about some incidents before where the plane, the gear is down and the gear absorbs a lot of the impact force, when the plane comes down belly down. In this case, they were left wing down. I don't know that the gear would have really absorbed much more. Prominent ground scars were observed at the beginning of the debris field about 40 feet from the last tree impact that were consistent with the dimensional measurements of the left wing to the fuselage. The first scars contained several pieces of the left wing. Ground scars were consistent with the separation of the left wing at its root. Debris from the airplane was scattered along the wreckage path in the field. The left engine's propeller and reduction gearbox assembly were located about 160 feet past the tree line. The Safety Board's Airplane Performance Group used its Windfall computer program to calculate the trajectory of the missing blade piece. This is the thing we were talking about. The group devised a search area and alerted the local residents and authorities about the missing piece. 3 weeks after the accident, the outboard piece of the blade was discovered by a farmer.
Oh.
It had been well hidden in some tall grass about 100 yards off the primary search area. That's always the really impressive part to me, when like something falls off of a plane and they kind of know where to look and then they find it.
Yeah. I mean, 100 yards isn't that far from, I don't know how big their search area was.
Yeah, but 100 yards, that's close.
Yeah. And it's like, we didn't find it in this area. Let's just expand the search.
And then, of course, it was a farmer who found it, so you let the people in the area know so they can be alert and look for it too.
How big was this part?
So I found a European website that lists the dimensions of this specific type of propeller. It's a Hamilton Standard 14RF-19. And the propeller blades are listed as being 3.35 meters, this would be actually the entire propeller assembly. So that's about 11 feet across. So let's say, it goes 2 sides, so it's divided in half. This is very rough math. 5.5 feet, they had a foot left. So this is probably about a 4-foot section of propeller that they found. Roughly, if this dimension is correct, and if I'm doing my math correctly, that would be my best guess. So if that's not exact, that at least gives you an idea roughly of how big the part would probably be.
So it's big, but not like not like so big that you're like, how you're going to obviously see it.
Right.
Especially in tall grass.
Right. If it was a 4-foot tall kid playing hide and seek in the grass, you'd have trouble finding him. Based on the dispatch records, investigators estimated that about 350 gallons of fuel were on board at the time of the accident. Per normal operating practice, the fuel would have been equally distributed between the left and right side tanks. The fuel is normally stored like in the wings. That's where the tanks are. The 2 tanks in the left wing separated early during the impact sequence, and there was evidence of fuel spilled on the vegetation along the wreckage path. The inboard tank in the right wing was found burned at the accident site, but the outboard tank was intact. Passengers did not observe fire until after the airplane came to a complete stop. They said there was a period of about 1 minute before the outbreak of fire. So they crashed, everything stopped, and there was about a minute, and then the fire started. The passengers described black smoke and flame consistent with what would be expected of a fuel-fed fire. Passengers reported that the fire was immediately preceded by cracking sounds and sparks from wires and cables, and that the fire started in small patches and spread quickly, fully engulfing the area aft of the cockpit entrance door. Some passengers related they found portions of their clothing saturated with fuel.
Oh my God.
And one passenger saw a couple of people on fire.
Oh no.
Remember, we talked about how only the captain died in the actual crash. The other people who passed away were because of the post-crash fire.
Oh.
The flight attendant and several passengers said they had to run through flames to escape from the cabin wreckage.
Oh, and if you're covered in fuel.
Right. That's how these other people died in this crash, either from smoke inhalation or because fuel had been spilled everywhere and then a fire started and then they had to run through flames to get out of the wreckage.
God, that's the worst is whenever you survive you survive something and then you end up dying because of like on the escape where you know, it's like
you think you're fine.
Yeah.
What was even worse is that some people, ran through the fire to get out of the wreckage, caught, some parts of their clothing caught fire. And then, they tried to stop, drop, and roll.
Oh, no.
But there was fuel on the ground.
Oh, no.
Yeah, it was an awful situation all around.
Oh, my God. That's the worst.
And like I said, the captain died as a result of the crash. The first officer survived. However, he was trapped in the cockpit. There was no way for him to get out.
Oh.
So he had a fire axe in the cockpit with him, but his, it's small in there, so he didn't really have a lot of space to swing it. And his right shoulder was dislocated. So he was trying to use his fire axe to
hit the window,
and get out. But he couldn't get, a lot of force behind it. So he managed to make a little hole, and then he called a passenger over who had survived, and he handed the axe through the window to the passenger who was outside and, started using the axe to try to, create a bigger hole in the window for the first officer to escape. And then what made matters even worse was that there was a canister of emergency oxygen in the cockpit, which started leaking, which started fueling the fire even faster in the cockpit.
Oh, my God.
And then as the passenger was using the axe to try to smash open the window, the handle flew off, or not the handle, the head flew off of the axe.
Oh,
and the passenger had to run and go find it and put the axe back together.
At least it didn't fly off and hit someone.
No. But then eventually the rescue personnel show up and are able to pull the first officer out. He was severely injured, but the first officer did survive. So all told, the captain was the only one who suffered fatal injuries from the impact, and 7 passengers died as a result of the crash and subsequent fire, including 3 who died within 30 days of the crash. A 9th victim died 4 months after the crash from severe burn injuries. None of the passengers or crew escaped uninjured, so everyone got hurt at some point. A 10th passenger died 8 weeks after the crash from a heart attack and is sometimes listed as a fatality related to this crash. That's why I said either 9 or 10 people are listed as fatalities because of this.
He had a heart attack. Well, how old was he, or what was the condition?
It was a woman. She was a bit older. I don't remember her exact age, but some people say the stress of this accident and everything
in the fall,
just could have triggered this heart attack to occur. So that's why she's sometimes listed as a 10th victim, sometimes not.
Yeah.
So we talked about everything that's happened. It was very clear, both from from what the passenger saw and from what the investigators found at the site, that the propeller broke.
Mm-hmm.
The engine, as a result, was not balanced, so it twisted, got stuck in the wing. Plane crashed, spilled fuel, there's a fire.
Yeah.
So all of that's very clear. So then the big question is, why did that piece of the propeller snap? Why did that bit of propeller break? So we're going to kind of read through a bunch of things here, and we're going to get specifically into that.
I'm curious about that maintenance that they were supposed to do.
Yeah. Okay. Using the internet without ExpressVPN is like walking your dog in public without securing them on a leash. Most of the time, probably okay. But what if one day your dog runs away or gets dog-napped? It's better to be careful, especially when it's as simple as using ExpressVPN. When you're out and about at a restaurant, hotel, airport, any place where you'd connect to an unencrypted network, scary truth is your online data is not secure. Any hacker on the same network can gain access to and steal your personal data. Luckily, ExpressVPN creates a secure, encrypted tunnel between your device and the internet, so they can't do that. It would actually take a hacker with a supercomputer over 1 billion years just to get past ExpressVPN's encryption. Love ExpressVPN. Works on all my devices, my laptop, my phone, tablet, anything I put online, I can connect it. So I feel good no matter where I go or what I connect with. It's really simple to use. All you do, open up the app, click one button to get protected. Couldn't be any easier. One button. Right now, you can get extra 3 months of ExpressVPN free at expressvpn.com/blackboxdown. That's expressvpn.com/blackboxdown. expressvpn.com/blackboxdown. black box down. One of my New Year's resolutions was to cook more at home, but sometimes it can seem daunting to make sure I have all the right ingredients and the correct portions and sizes. That's why I love Green Chef. When you use Green Chef, everything is pre-portioned and fresh. You're even reducing your food waste by up to 38% versus grocery shopping. They also just expanded their menu to include more than 30 recipes to choose from weekly, including keto, vegan, vegetarian, fast and fit, Mediterranean, and gluten-free options. Personally, I pick up the vegetarian options. I think it's great. I can get everything. I don't have to worry about if it's something I can eat or not. It's all pre-selected for me, super fast to make. And when it's done, I get a little project. When it's done, I get to eat it, and it's absolutely delicious. I'm always excited about every recipe that they include for me. Sometimes it's things that maybe I don't normally eat, and it can help introduce me to new things and things that kind of break the routine. In case you didn't know, Green Chef is now owned by HelloFresh. With a wider array of meal plans to choose from, there really is something for everyone. Plus, as an added bonus, Green Chef is the only meal kit that offsets 100% of their carbon footprint, as well as 100% of the plastic in every box. In 2023, help yourself to delicious, convenient recipes that support your healthy lifestyle and taste good too. Go to greenchef.com/blackboxdown60 and use code blackboxdown60 to get 60% off plus free shipping. That's greenchef.com/blackboxdown60 with code blackboxdown60 for 60% off and free shipping. So, of course, there's the usual carve out. In an incident like this, there's a lot of very typical verbiage that the flight crew was trained, they were certified, they were qualified, they were in good health. Basically, it's all the stuff that absolves the crew of fault. It also says that the airline maintained the airplane in accordance with the applicable federal aviation regulations and company operation specifications. So I know you were that kind of starts to play into the check you were asking about. After the propeller blade separation, the combination of resulting loss of left engine thrust, increased drag from a deformed engine nacelle, and the three blades retained in the propeller hub added frontal drag from external sheet metal damage, degraded airplane performance, preventing the flight crew from arresting the airplane's descent or making rapid changes in its direction of flight, making a forced landing necessary. So just kind of the technical summary of the engine blew up, got twisted, and made them descend, and they couldn't control their direction very well.
And affirming that they weren't able to fly the plane.
Correct.
It's not a lack of handling of the situation from the crew.
Correct. One of the four blades from the left engine propeller separated in flight because of fatigue crack that originated from multiple corrosion pits in the taper bore surface of the blade spar propagated toward the outside of the blade around both sides of the taper bore, then reached critical size.
Gus, it's always those fatigue cracks.
It is. It's fatigue cracks. They're scary. So I learned a lot about propeller blades getting ready for this episode, Chris. And it turns out, and I didn't talk about this because this is kind of the twist that's coming here. This was a recurring problem with these propeller blades.
Oh.
There had been a couple of other incidents and crashes where these blades had been failing and having fatigue cracks. So there had been maintenance as a result of this. The investigation boards knew this was an ongoing issue. So all of these propellers had been taken out of service, inspected. Then, if they were deemed to be okay, they were put back into service, or if they needed repair, they were repaired and then put back into service. This specific propeller had been inspected and had been given a clean bill of health and had been returned to service.
When?
I'm gonna get to that. So I'm just kind of setting all of that up. So that kind of helps establish these next few points I'm going to read through. So I'm just kind of setting that right now. Because of the severely degraded aircraft performance following the propeller blade separation, the flight crew's actions were reasonable and appropriate during their attempts to control and maneuver the airplane throughout the accident sequence, and they were not a factor in this accident. So again, absolving the crew, they did everything that they were expected to do. Hamilton Standard was the manufacturer of the propeller.
Okay.
Hamilton Standard's engineering decision to use the PS960A blending repair to remove ultrasonic indications caused by a short peen taper bore surface was technically reasonable. Some of these are kind of technical. I'm going to read through a couple more, and then we're going to go back and explain them. The manner in which the unapproved extension of the PS960A was documented and communicated within Hamilton Standard, and the lack of training on the extension created confusion and led to misapplication of the blending repair to the unshot peened blades with unexplained ultrasonic indications, allowing the accident blade to be placed back into service with an existing crack. So, okay, what this is, there's a couple more, but I'm going to interject now because it's getting overwhelming. These propellers can be made out of Well, this propeller was made out of wood. I'll just say that.
Wood?
Yeah, because it's light, strong.
Huh.
And they have like a coating on them.
Yeah.
You know, that makes them, that black coating that you see on them, that kind of holds them together and makes them stronger. And they're also hollow in the middle. But you didn't know that. I didn't know that. Yeah, you know, again, in order to make them lighter.
Mm-hmm.
And what happens is there's like a bore drilled through the center of these propellers to kind of pull the core out and make it lighter. And then they stick a weight in there to kind of help it spin. And then they stop the weight with with a piece of cork that they soak in chlorine. Chris, I know you probably have a puzzled look on your face. That's just the way that it works normally. So when they had to inspect these propellers to see if they were okay to go back into service, you know, a technician goes, they pull the cork and the weight out. They do like ultrasonic testing. And if they determined it was okay, the technician was told to then polish the inside of that core, that's the inside of that hollow area, and then stick the weight and the cork back in there to hold it. Well, it turns out that even though this propeller inspected and said that it was okay, there were some very small fatigue cracks. And then when the technician repolished the inside, it kind of covered up and hid the fatigue cracks. So they were even harder to detect. And then
wait, so how do they know that there were fatigue cracks then?
Without post crash,
because they went back and looked,
them. Right?
They could be like, inside. Oh, here's the crack. Oh, and here's where it was polished over.
Right. But now that it's broken open, you can see it. When it's not broken open, you can't tell, or you couldn't tell. And then so he polished it, and then when he stuck that, or when they stuck, I don't want to sound like I'm blaming that technician. He was doing what he was told to do. That piece of cork that was soaked in chlorine, the chlorine got in there and exacerbated the cracks and made them worse. So that's kind of the short of it. And there's a lot. That's all of this I'm talking about. You know, shot peen taper bore surfaces and unshot peen blades. That's kind of what all of this is. I'm kind of trying to explain it.
No, you're doing a good job. You're distilling it down. If you told me just like, you know, they pulled the cork off the plane blade and, you know, wiggle it around and checked for, it's like, what?
Yeah, it sounds made up. The sanding marks left by the blending repair did not contribute to the initiation of the fatigue crack in the accident blade. Remember I said, to polish it. That's that. So sanding marks did not make it worse. The failure to restore the taper bore surface to the original surface finish as required by PS 960A was a factor that caused a reduction of the ultrasonic indication that allowed the blade to pass the final ultrasonic inspection and be returned to service. So like I said, when they didn't restore the taper bore surface to the original finish, that kind of hit it because he polished it. It wasn't the original finish anymore. So that's why it passed. It was kind of like inadvertently. It kind of hit it. It kind of like covered over the surface of those cracks.
I thought so. So the way they were doing that is they pull out the cork and the weight, and then they
polish it.
They polish it first.
Yeah, and then look.
That's weird.
It is. It's not. And in fact, that's the next point on here. The bore scope inspection procedure developed and used by Hamilton Standard in June of 1994 to inspect return blades that had rejectable ultrasonic indications for evidence of cracks, pits, and corrosion was inadequate and ineffective. So this was not a good procedure for them to be following to do this.
Yeah. That's weird that they would polish it first.
I'm with you, Chris. I don't know. I don't know what to say. The introductory technical training to prepare the new inexperienced workforce at Hamilton Standard's Rock Hill Customer Service Center might have been adequate, but the training initially given to technicians who inspected blades that were returned to Rock Hill as a result of on-wing ultrasonic inspections, including the accident blade, was inadequate to ensure proficiency in the detection of taper bore corrosion or associated cracks. So they're kind of saying it's a training issue with the technicians who were looking at these propellers. They were trained the wrong way.
They were trained to look for them incorrectly.
Correct.
So the actual way that they were supposed to do it would have taken care of it.
Well, it's not that there was a way they were supposed to do it, because this is the propeller blade manufacturer. Remember, this is kind of an unforeseen problem. So they invented this, or I shouldn't say they developed this process to look for the problem, but the process itself was bad.
Yeah. So whoever developed it
Correct. It's their fault.
I have a question too. These cracks, these that are coming about, are they due to like age and time, or is it some of the blades just when they were built, had a tendency to develop these flaws? So if you were to check them and check them correctly, right, would they then be fine? Was it like you know what I mean? Was it a one-time thing? They checked them all to see, or would they have to continue to do it every,
This was abnormal. I don't know what the underlying cause that resulted in these numerous failures was, but this was not something that was expected. This was not, that's why they kind of had to invent this process to inspect the propellers, and this was not within the normal expectations that they would have.
Mm.
And I want to clarify something I said earlier. So these propellers were made of wood. Not all propellers. I think earlier I said propellers are made of wood. I didn't give an asterisk.
Oh, I assume.
Yeah, sometimes they're made of aluminum or composites, but especially at this time and this specific propellers we're talking about, these are wood. I don't want anyone thinking all propellers all the time are made of wood. There can be a number of materials. If Hamilton Standard had recommended and the FAA had required, repetitive ultrasonic inspections for all propellers after shortcomings were recognized and improvements were made in the inspection process, the crack in the accident blade would most likely have been detected. There is a potential for corrosion to develop in taper bores of the affected Hamilton Standard propeller blades. We kind of know that. The cloud ceiling precluded the flight crew from being able to see the ground and thus to make a more successful forced landing. Remember, we talked about how there were clouds, and that's just kind of saying that maybe if it had been a clear day, they could have found a better spot to put the plane down.
Where it's like, oh, maybe without trees.
Right.
Like a flat,
But again, that's
hearsay.
That's beyond their control, and that's also speculation.
How long had passed since this propeller had been inspected?
So this blade that failed testing had undergone this ultrasonic testing May 19th, 1994. And then, all this was done and it was sent back to the airline and it was fitted onto the aircraft September 30th, 1994. So almost a year had passed between that. Although the Atlanta approach controller did not issue the AWOS frequency, that's the weather, so the pilots can listen to the weather. They did not issue the AWOS frequency or provide weather information. The controller performed higher priority tasks, and because the flight had to land at the nearest airport, regardless of the weather, the failure to provide the West Georgia weather information of the flight crew was not a factor in this accident.
Sorry, going back to this polishing.
Yeah.
I assume that they could tell because the cracks were polished away that they definitely had been present before the inspection,
yes,
right?
I think they can see, again, once the propeller's cracked open, you can see the extent of it.
Versus and even the fact that the what did you say, alcohol or what did chlorine they put on it, that made it worse. So as opposed to the cracks developing in that year.
Exactly.
Okay.
It's not a great analogy, but the analogy I would give you is this. It's like if you have a house and you see a couple of termites and you're like, oh no, I know there's termites. I don't know what the damage looks like inside the walls. If we want to know truly the extent of the damage, we need to open up the walls and look. It's kind of the same thing where it's like you see a crack on the outside and you don't know really what the extent is, except you can't. Maybe you can detect termites with ultrasonic testing. I don't know. But that's kind of how they have to look at it. They can't crack open the propeller. They can't break the propeller to determine if what's going on with it. So they use this ultrasonic testing to look. And in this case, the polishing of it kind of hid the damage. So we didn't get into this part. I'm gonna read this part here, and then we're gonna talk about this in just a bit. If Atlanta Center had placed a call for emergency services as soon as the pilots requested, which was 10 minutes before the accident, personnel would have responded sooner, and the rescue efforts might have been more timely and therefore more effective.
They waited to call?
Yeah, the air traffic control didn't alert any of the emergency services. Remember,
for how long?
10 minutes. Remember that couple I told you who called emergency services?
They're the ones who did.
They're the one that emergency services had no idea about this until after the crash, and that couple calls for them. So
what?
Yeah, if they had been alerted sooner by air traffic control, this might have ended up differently. There might have been
people,
emergency services waiting at the airport or along the way, knowing that this plane could come down and have been there.
They were only 4 miles away. We already
put the fire out, made it easier for those people to escape. These people could, again, it's hard to say. If they had been alerted, it's possible these people may have survived.
But they didn't have any. They didn't. Oh my God, that's bad.
That's really bad. I think that's maybe the worst part of all of this.
It feels like, I mean,
not counting, of course, the
incident itself, but like it seems like it was caused by not inherent negligence, just a bad procedure, right?
Right.
A bad They fixed the problem wrong, in that they didn't fix it,
right?
But that's
that's terrible. This accident illustrates that critical information regarding time available to prepare the aircraft for an emergency landing or impact is not being considered and communicated among flight and cabin crew members. Like we said, that one time is the only time that the pilots talked with the flight attendant, and she didn't know that they were about to touch down. Like she looked out the window and saw treetops. I was like, "Oh, we're about to we're about to crash right now." So she had to like run to her seat, strap in and yell at everyone to get in their brace position. She had already been preparing the cabin,
but didn't realize,
but didn't know how soon they were going to be landing.
Mm.
And again, the clouds may have obscured their or her view or anyone's view. I think actually, in fact, they didn't tell. They only told her they were going back to Atlanta. They didn't tell her that they were diverting somewhere else. So she didn't. She really had no idea.
Yeah. And I mean, because they kind of descended faster than they meant to. They were probably trying to deal with that, and they didn't communicate.
And then the last one on here is there should be standards governing the design of crash axes required to be carried aboard passenger carrying aircraft. They just kind of want to make those crash axes.
Crash axes.
Right. Remember I said that the first officer was trying to use the axe and couldn't.
And it fell apart.
Yeah, and then he gave it to the passenger and it fell apart. So they just want to make those crash axes better.
Hey, that's good.
Makes total sense.
That's a good little tidbit, but yeah.
The National Transportation Safety Board determines the probable cause of this accident was an in-flight fatigue fracture and separation of a propeller blade, resulting in distortion of the left engine nacelle, causing excessive drag, loss of wing lift, and reduced directional control of the airplane. The fracture was caused by a fatigue crack from multiple corrosion pits that were not discovered by Hamilton standard because of inadequate and ineffective corporate inspection and repair techniques, training, documentation, and communications. Contributing to the accident was Hamilton standard and the FAA's failure to require recurrent on-wing ultrasonic inspections for the affected propellers. And contributing to the severity of the accident was the overcast cloud ceiling at the accident site. Yeah, but that's it. There was another incident that was very similar to this. I don't think we'll ever do an episode about it, but if our listeners are curious, it's also Atlantic Southeast. It's Atlantic Southeast Airlines Flight 2311. It's the same kind of plane and had essentially the same issue where the propeller broke because of these fatigue cracks. So if you're curious to read more about or look into more about another incident that's not almost identical, that's very similar to this one, you can look up Atlantic Southeast Airlines Flight 2311. That's the one that happened 4 years before this incident that kind of kicked off hey, there's something wrong with these propellers. We need to look into them.
So after this, did they swap out all the propellers or did they change their process for inspecting them or what?
They updated the inspection process and made it more rigorous in order to try to catch these. And to their credit, the new inspection process worked, and this never happened again.
Okay.
They learned. I mean, that's the ultimate thing you want to hear from our episodes, and hopefully that's the thing we drive home, is that despite the awful tragedy and the terrible circumstances, things are learned, and things get safer because of all of these accidents.
Yeah. Fix the propeller inspection method, better axes. But I want to know, what happened to the air traffic control who didn't alert? Did they get,
I don't think there was any
criminal charges against,
No, I don't think there was any repercussions against them. As far as I know, that was not mentioned in the report. And in reading up on this crash, I did not find anything about that. It's possible, but I just didn't come across anything addressing that.
Okay. Because, that's to me is almost like the worst part, I guess. I mean, the plane crashing, obviously, but just the negligence of that.
Yeah, it's terrible. But yeah, that's it for Atlantic Southeast Airlines Flight 529. I learned a lot about propellers in looking into this episode. I'll see if I can find some diagrams on social media of what a cutaway wood propeller looks like with that bore hole and the weight and the cork and all of that. I'll see if I can find some good ones and post them on social media for this episode.
I'd be curious too, if it's not too graphic, to see what the ground looked like, the way it hit. Because you talked about it burning and then hitting trees.
Yeah, I've seen, in looking into this, I saw photos of the fuselage itself. I don't know if I saw any wide photos of the area surrounding it. I'll see if I can dig something up. And if I can, I'll post that as well. But yeah, that's it for this episode. We'll be back next week with another episode.
Yeah, thank you, everyone. Please share this podcast with your friends. And if you're looking for something else to listen to, you should listen to Tales from Stinky Dragon. It's a comedy fantasy podcast that me and Gus do with some friends. And also Gus has another podcast. Gus?
Oh, I've got so many podcasts, Chris. You can listen to Anima Podcast or RT, Rooster Teeth Podcast, if you're looking for things a little more lighthearted.
Yeah.
But yeah. All right. Bye.
Bye.